Just that you know, we are recording the session, so if you don't like that, now's the time to hop off. But I hope you stay. This is the first webinar in a series we planned on funding issues, on all aspects of getting money for your startup, because it's one of the most frequently asked question to ELTA. Guys, can you help us with getting money? So if you look at the market, the legal tech market today, looks like money is getting thrown around in all directions. But if you're a legal tech startup, you probably think, except in my direction, because it's hard to get money for a specific legal tech startup. And so we thought what we can do as ELTA, because we don't have any money to invest into your companies, but what we can do is educate you on different aspects, where to get money, including some really exotic sources, and to connect you to people who have money and are willing to invest in your startups. And on the way, a little bit educating you again, also on how to look at how to look for funding, how to prepare yourself, how to pitch your idea, and so on and so on, because there might be different approaches, and you might think you have the most interesting idea and know how to pitch it to an investor, but the investor itself may think differently. So that might be an additional value of those series. So today we start with an interesting project platform called 47 Pitches, and we have with us two people from that company. It's Mark Dage and Devin Engelmore. Thank you for joining us today, guys, and for taking your time to explain what you're doing and what you can offer to the market, to those who joined today and who will listen it after that on our video YouTube channel. So that's all for from my side. Mark and Devin, take it away.
Great. Well, thanks very much for having us. It's really kind of an honor. And we're all about law tech, and we're all about helping law tech get funded. We were just talking earlier about access to justice issues, which is, not the only reason to be in law tech, but we think it's the paramount issue to provide greater access to justice, more equal access to justice. From our perspective, the legal system, and I'm speaking somewhat parochial about the American system, but I know a little bit about the European system. So I think a lot of the problems in the American system are found in other systems, and basically for the same reason, in that law is a technical enterprise. And because it's technical and it's competitive, particularly if you get into litigation. So when you combine those two things, you end up with almost an infinite amount of money you can spend competing against adversaries, to spend money to find the best technicians, i.e. lawyers, and to go through the most arcane processes. It's a little like healthcare in America, which is, you probably read about. There's always room for one more test, and everybody makes money on that one more test, so why not have two more tests? And this is kind of what's happened with law. When we started out, and I should back up just a second. So my background, I've been an investment banker, I've been a investor, and I've been a startup founder. So I've sort of looked at this, this area of the market, funding innovation from all different angles. And the grass isn't greener on any of them. They're all really hard endeavors to do. But when we started our initial law tech project, which was sort of started by accident, actually. But then when we started to get serious about it, I started researching it. And I found this wonderful paper on the internet. And I'm pretty dyslexic, so I just start reading stuff like halfway through the paragraph and, wander around. And it was so pertinent to what we were doing, which was basically seeing if you could apply technology to fix the U.S. legal system in any case. And the paper was talking about how people were getting priced out of the legal system, reduced access to justice, the sort of perverted incentives for the legal industry to bill more, and how this was affecting commerce and trade because it was becoming so expensive to engage lawyers. And I thought, wow, this is really relevant. But I noticed when I was looking at the document, it was a printed document. It was an image document rather than a digital document. And I thought it was a little strange. They were basically photographs of pages rather than digitized. But I didn't think much of it. So I read through the whole thing, and I'm really excited about being able to use this in our offering documents as a relevant source. And I get down to the bottom, and I discovered why they were images, because the article was from 1929. It was an article that was published in the American Bar Association. So those issues back then that the author was talking about being an emergency and something that had to be addressed immediately are the same issues that people are looking at today. And that tells you a lot about how little innovation and how little progress has been made in the civil litigation anyway space. And there really hasn't been that much innovation. There's some cool stuff coming out now, and I imagine a lot of people on this call are doing some really interesting things, and that's great. But for 200 years anyway, which is a long time in the U.S., basically, I guess, arbitration and e-discovery are like momentous evolutions. And that doesn't say too much about the marketplace and the legal industry itself in terms of how it adopts technology. One of the reasons for that is that law basically is again, I'm speaking more about America, and I know a little bit about the German system, and I know that it has some differences. But law in the US and in many other countries is a cost plus business, meaning that you hire a lawyer and the lawyer is going to charge you a fee, and they're going to add on whatever their profit margin is. And they don't really care whether they're charging you $1,000 an hour or $500 an hour, or what the cost is, because they're marking it up above and beyond their cost. So they don't have a strong incentive to reduce cost. And just if you look at they used to use word perfect long after Microsoft was out. So trying to get innovation into the legal community is not that easy. It's changing. It's changing partly because corporations are demanding more efficient legal representation. Courts are overcrowded. COVID has done a lot to make people aware. I mean, maybe you could say Zoom is even bigger legal innovation, but it's still pretty flat-footed. I mean, just taking the same processes and porting them onto a video format isn't very revolutionary. With that in mind, my background is basically pretty varied. I studied legal philosophy, was going to go into law, couldn't afford to go into law, and ended up becoming an investment banker, which was supposed to be, a 2-month, job for me. That was the way I looked at it. Ended up doing it for, a number of years, and always thought maybe I'd get back into law. Devin, who's on the call here, is a law student, pre-law student, and will be going into law. So he's gonna have a better start than I did. But I kept coming back to it. What I did do was a lot of creative financing back in the late, and sorry for rambling on, but there's a purpose to this story. Back in the late 1990s, my former from those investors, these were smart people that understood, that were very creative, and they understood, they didn't have the boundaries, mental boundaries of the main investment banks. They funded our little company. It worked out really well. And it really took off. So we funded about 135 companies in a period of about a year and a half. We raised over $1 billion, which, for anybody who was alive back in the late 90s, that was like real money back then. Some of the companies we funded went on to become really big companies. We funded Celgene, which was a biotech company that had the licensing rights to thalidomide, which was not an easy sell back then. That became one of the biggest biotechs in the world. So anyway, and I tell you the story because, what happened was we ended up making a lot of money ourselves. We had a lot of fun. We thought we were geniuses. Took about a year and a half for the markets to tell us we weren't. Basically, Wall Street came in and kind of took over that market, but it was fine because, we'd funded a lot of great companies, raised capital, made a lot of money for ourselves at a, fairly young age, and went on and did other things. So I tell you this because we see a similar opportunity today. It's not exactly the same, but there's parallels in that what's happening in the macro situation is that there's this wonderful startup ecosystem that is no longer concentrated in Silicon Valley. We see startups from everywhere in the world. I mean, Eastern Europe, Western Europe, Asia, India, Pakistan, Latin America, all over the place, because it's all about creativity. Capital is really not as much of a constraint. Yes, you do need some capital, but you don't need the millions of dollars that you would need to go to a Wall Street kind of bank to raise, to prove concept on a startup. So that's a really wonderful thing. And this ecosystem continues to grow. Europe has had a few, really interesting projects come out with, ending up with really multi-billion-dollar great valuations. And there's a whole bunch more in the pipeline. And again, that's expanding beyond Europe to areas that you just normally wouldn't associate with billion-dollar startups. So as a former banker, I like to say reformed banker, because banking was never something I really wanted to do. It was supposed to be a 2-month job while I was living with my sister in Atlanta to try to feed myself. We love this opportunity. This ecosystem, startup ecosystem, which I assume many people on this call are part of, has a deficiency, and that's with capital. There's still not a lot of ready access to capital, at least not on the level that you would find in Silicon Valley and, a couple other spots. Very interesting things going on in Paris and Berlin, London to an extent, but it's still not there. The infrastructure to consistently take great ideas and great entrepreneurs and turn those into, billion-dollar companies quickly is not there. So we sort of see that as our role. Because of my interest in law tech, and because law tech's really challenging space to fund, we kind of wanted to start in that space and prove ourselves that, we could bring capital into law tech. Again, because it is more difficult than a lot of spaces. The reasons law tech is more difficult, and you know them probably, but law is viewed as sort of an institutional monopoly in most areas. You have this set of rules. There's limited things that you can do outside of those rules. It's not like going into food delivery or AI or some of these other spaces where you build a machine, you put it out there, and there isn't much regulation. So that's one thing that keeps a lot of the mainstream investors out of it.
Finiamolo con questa buffonata.
Hello? Okay. I just saw Paulo come up there. That's one issue. The other issue is there's not a lot of, there haven't been a lot of huge successes in law tech. You're starting to see some, and there's a little more money coming into it now, but it's still pretty limited. Again, you don't have the, the Ubers and the Airbnbs and those type of examples to really get investors excited. And investors, like it or not, are sheep. There isn't as much creativity as we'd like to see particularly in the VC networks. They kind of look at what worked before, and they want to come in on the sequel. They want a template that says it's going to be, going to work. So you have projects like Atrium that was a darling for a while. They acquired a lot of funding, mainly on the basis of their founder's previous success. And they really didn't have a business model that worked, and they collapsed, and people lost a lot of money. You have Ironclad and a few other projects that are making money. And again, it's a little bit encouraging. But if you're building a startup in law tech, you've got an uphill battle. And it's a bigger uphill battle than if you were building a startup in, AI, IoT, food delivery, fintech, you name it. But that's both good and bad because, again, we like to take on challenges and we like to go in areas that, that seem unfundable. And then, as we did in the 90s, find creative ways to fund. So, sorry for that big background, but that brings us to kind of our approach and how we're trying to help companies get funding. And again, law tech is a focus. We're not exclusive to law tech. We have different spaces. Right now, we're running pitch contests for law tech, blockchain, women founders, and a general category of innovation, which can be almost anything. We'll soon be starting pitch contests for AI, entertainment, arts and entertainment, cannabis, which is a big popular issue here in the States right now. There's another category, I'll think of it in a minute. It's a very organic process in that what happens is when we have 50 startups that have applied on our platform that our investors tell us they're excited about, we start a contest. So I guess you get right into that. Devin, do you want to walk through the process? Do you want me to? It's.
No, I can talk about it.
Great.
So the way the sign-up process works and the process of the pitch contest itself, firstly, signing up, it's pretty simple, pretty easy. It takes just about 5 minutes. And in doing so, you just go to our platform or the website, scroll down the page a little bit, and then you'll find the application button. There, you just upload a 1 to 2 minute product video that just kind of gives a quick overview, almost an advertisement of your product or your company. And then you type out a short 30-word pitch. If you can make it shorter than 30 words, that's great. But you're just pretty much telling us why you're great and why investors should be investing in you. And so while all of that's happening, we onboard about 50 legal tech startups, and that's going to be phase one. So while all of that's happening in phase one, our pool of investors rank the top 5 projects on a 1 to 5 level, obviously using a 1 to 5 star rating process. And from there, they move on. So the top 5 projects will move on to phase 2. And in phase 2, that's where the actual funding and negotiating starts to occur with the investors. You can negotiate one-on-one. You can negotiate with syndicates if the investors form one. And ultimately, there will be a winner to the contest, but that doesn't necessarily go to say that you lose at any point during the contest, because you can still take away from this entire platform either a network connection with an investor or some mentorship advice from some of our community insiders, which could be anybody from a law professor here in the States to Mark Beer, which is one of our advisors, Um, and I mean, other project founders who, you know, want to mentor you as well, or maybe give you constructive feedback on the entire process. We try to make it pretty simple, pretty easy, and I think all around just a little fun for most people. At least that's what I've been hearing back from some of the signups, that this is something that they really enjoy. Being in a pitch contest, it kind of opens up people's competitiveness, and all around. I mean, you don't really lose anything. There is almost nothing to lose from this process, or from signing up at least, and you could just take away whatever you want to take away from this. And then I'll let Mark explain a little bit more in depth from here.
Yeah, so Devin did a great job on that. I wish I was as smart as he is in college. Took me quite a few more years to catch up with him. So what we do is create a community approach. And Devin outlined the initial phase pretty well. So we break it down in 3 phases. And again, this is all about making things simple. Fundraising should not be complicated. You shouldn't have to spend 6 to 12 months of your life figuring out how fundraising works, because it's very ephemeral. Once you think you figured it out, you'll talk to a VC and they'll tell you, oh, you're doing this all wrong, or, you know, this is not our approach, or send us a different slide deck or whatever. So we're trying to, again, simplify it, make it fun. Believe it or not, raising capital can be a lot of fun, and remove what is probably the biggest challenge that anybody with a law tech project has, any kind of startup project, is basically what we call an investor inertia. You talk to an investor, it might take you 6 months to connect with the right investor. You get a chance to talk to them, and you have a wonderful conversation. Maybe it's a Zoom call. And at the end of that conversation, they tell you how great you are. They tell you how much they love your project. And then they tell you, let's keep in touch. And when you hear let's keep in touch, you know, you're probably polite and you smile, but internally you're saying, well, what does let's keep in touch mean? I need money today. I need money yesterday. I don't need money in let's keep in touch time. But the reality is, to raise capital, what's usually missing in most startups is a catalyst. For investors to, you know, investors will naturally believe that their money's safer staying in their bank account than it is transferring to yours. So they need a good reason to make the transfer from their bank account to your account and actually invest in your project. You know, traditionally, catalyst will be, you know, if you form you know, you get a contract for your services from Denton's or, you know, British Airways or Amazon or somebody like that. That's a great catalyst. You go back to the VCs and you say, look, you know, Amazon gave us this contract. They'll all invest. But sometimes you need the capital before you can actually get to the point where you can get those kind of events. So what we do is create an internal catalyst. And the way we do it is, I'll just sort of rehash what Devin already said. Phase 1 is really simple. It takes about 5 minutes to apply if you have a video. So you come to the site, you upload your video, it's 2 minutes maximum. Your video can be anything. It can be a selfie video, it can be a polished, you know, production video. If you look at our sites, you'll see a you know, great deal of variety. It just can't be more than 2 minutes. It can be focused on your product. It can be focused on your team. It can be focused on the problem. It doesn't really matter. I personally like product focused videos, because if the investor gets the idea what your product is, they can, you know, deduce kind of what you're doing and how it works. But it doesn't matter. So your video goes up on our site, and phase 1 is really like a TikTok for startups. It's that simple. If you imagine an investor that's interested in the law tech space, they can sit down and they can run through, I can run through anyway, 20 to 30 videos in a sitting. I cannot run through 20 to 30 slide decks in a sitting. I can get through about 7, and then I stop reading past the first or second slide. And that's again, a big part of what we do is just making it simple. If you're sending slide decks to investors that really haven't got the general idea what you're doing, you're probably wasting your time. They're not, their problem is even worse. I mean, they get so many decks that they tend to pass them down to lower level people. You know, they're not decision makers. They create files that they put the slide deck in. And if they get interested in the space 2 years later, they might drag them back out. They might even contact you, but that's a really slow way to go. So again, our first phase is you launch your video on our site. You add a 30-word pitch, which should really just capture the value proposition of what you're doing. Intuitively, most startups want to try to preempt every possible question an investor can have. That's a big mistake. You really want them to walk away with more questions than answers. And again, I realize that's counterintuitive, but you want the investor to want to learn more. You don't want the investor to walk away thinking they understand your model and maybe they like it, maybe they don't. So that's phase one. There's no charge for it. There's no charge for anything, by the way, for startups on our site. Having been a startup founder, I know how frustrating it is when you're trying to have money coming in and instead it's all going out. There's you know, tons of people and platforms that are delighted to help you for $1,000 or $200 or, you know, $5,000 or a piece of any funding that you might happen to get down the road. So we don't believe in that. Our goal is to help get you funded. That's why we don't charge. We have a very minor premium feature that's not that relevant. It's a firewall if you want to put confidential information, and I think we charge about $15 a month for that. So it's pretty inconsequential, and most startups don't need it. So then going to phase two is by invitation. And in phase one, I should, just to be correct, we do vet the phase one projects, but as long as they're innovative, as long as the team looks serious, you'll probably be accepted into phase one. Phase two is a little more selective. And what happens is we have an internal ranking system. If you look on our site, you'll see a rating system. And that's the first phase rating system. And what happens is we invite our investors to rank the projects, rate the projects, let's say, in phase one to give us an idea, is there a minimum level of interest? So we don't want startups pitching to a cold audience. So if in the process of phase one, there's not enough excitement by their investor community to invite you to phase two, we don't. We think, you know, part of raising money, part of helping startups is being very honest. And if our investor community is not excited about the project, then the worst thing we can do is kind of, you know, tell you, well, give it a shot, or, you know, maybe it'll work out. So, and it doesn't mean it's a bad project. It just means that the chemistry with the particular combination of investors we have at the time aren't excited enough to invite you to phase two. If that happens, you can stay in phase one until there is enough chemistry. And that can change because we have new investors coming on at all times. So assuming that the investors give us these signals that, yeah, we'd kind of like to learn more about this project, we'd like to bring them into the formal pitch contest, you enter phase two. Phase two is pretty easy too. It will take you longer. It'll probably take you an hour to apply to phase two, but you don't have to worry about it until you're invited. So in phase two, you add your slide deck, you add business summary. We have about a dozen questions that our investors tell us that they're going to ask of any startup. So why make the startup answer them for each investor? Milestones are a really important part of phase two because it gives the investor an idea what you've done, what you plan to do, and then they can track you as you move through those milestones and meet or exceed them. If you stumble, that you can communicate with them why you didn't meet a particular milestone. So the The other interesting aspect I think about phase two and the pitch contest in general is when you're invited to phase two. Phase one, it's pretty generic. You can identify with law tech, but it doesn't really matter because the investors are going to look at all the different projects. Phase two, you're invited to a specific contest, and let's use law tech because that's going on right now, and we're getting ready to start that hopefully pretty soon. A couple of unique features. So you sign up for phase two, you're invited to phase two. You don't have to go from phase one to phase two, by the way, it's your option. If you choose to participate in phase two, then what the startups do is they stake future investment rights in their project to our community. And that's done through a SAFE agreement. If everybody's probably, since this is law tech, everybody's probably somewhat familiar with SAFE agreements. They're basically a simplified agreement originated by Y Combinator. Ours are a little different. Each contest has different terms to the SAFE agreements, but in general, what that SAFE agreement does is provide the investors who earn it, and I'll explain that in a minute, the right to invest in your project over 12 months alongside any other funding you do on equal terms. You determine how much they can invest. And typically the startups can put a fixed valuation that the investors can invest at any time under that fixed valuation. So to make this a little more concrete, let's say you want to raise, I don't know, let's use $3 million, and you're going to say, I'll allocate $1 million to the 47 pitch contest. And we'll give the investors the right to co-invest in any fundings we do for 12 months. But at any time they can also invest at, let's call it a $5 million valuation. And that may be a little high for some of the startups, but let's use that because I'm not good at math and we can do the numbers easily. So great. So you stake this amount of capital under the terms of the SAFE agreement to the community. And then what happens is the investor community competes to earn those SAFE rights. And the way they compete, as Devin mentioned, they compete, it's really simple. They get to rank 5 projects as their favorite 5 out of typically 50 to 100 projects. Okay, so that gives them the incentive to get to know your project really quickly, to do their diligence, and then they have to make a decision. What are my favorite 5? That creates engagement from investors that you really can't find in most other pitch contests or accelerators or other approaches. They have to do their homework. They have to get to know you. And by the way they get to know you is you have your own profile on 47 pitches. You post this information that I mentioned before. You answer the questions, you post your milestones, and then you have your own messaging board. And that messaging board is where you can interact with our investor community. They can ask you questions, you can reach out to them. It creates a whole different energy because it's a group discussion, and you can create it creates more of a subtle level of competition because one investor sees another investor getting excited in your project. Another investor asks a question, you answer it for all the investors, and so it removes uncertainty and misinterpretations. It's a group dynamic as opposed to a one-on-one. And if you've been on one-on-one conversations with VCs, it's a little intimidating. You get the feeling they're holding all the cards because basically they're holding all the money. In a group, you create competition amongst the investors to be part of your deal. And they're competing for these SAFE rights. So let's say at the end of the contest, which is typically a 2-week contest, the investors have to put their rankings in. They pick 5. That creates a point system. So the projects that earn the most points and they rank in the top 3, we consider those the winners of the contest, which means that anybody who voted for the projects that end up with the most points in the top 3, they earn the safe agreements, the rights to invest in that project. Okay, so if you rank below the top 3, the safe agreement commitments are nullified. They just become void. Okay. So also, as Devin said, it's not necessarily that important you win the contest, though. The important thing is to compress the time frame to develop relationships with groups of investors. And that's really the goal. So let's use a hard example. Let's say a startup enters, they want to raise $1 million. They execute the SAFE agreement that entitles them to be part of the contest. The investors look at the project, they interact on the chat. At the end of 2 weeks, they say, well, this is one of my 5 favorite. They rank you. You end up in the top, let's say you end up number 2. So those investors who ranked you now have safe agreements. And again, to make the math easy, let's say there are 10 investors that rank the project to get them into the top 3. Let's say the project wants to raise $1 million. We'll make it even for now. So each investor then has the right to invest $100,000 into that particular project. Okay, all that's wonderful. Investors love having an option to invest in a project. It creates motivation. It allows them to get in earlier. But at this point, the problem would be if you give me a right to invest over 12 months, I'm going to wait to 11.5 months before I invest, because again, I'm going to keep my money safe if I have an option. So what happens is we don't do that. The safe rights are gated, meaning they have expiration dates. So let's say I'm one of these 10 investors and I got the right to invest $100,000 and I love the project. I want to be part of it. It's a little early for me maybe. So I'd prefer to wait. But what happens is if I don't make my first investment in 45 days, 1/3 of my rights expire. Okay. So now I'm down to 66,000 because I didn't make the investment and I lost the 33,000 went away. So I've got another 2 months. After 2 more months, if I haven't made an investment, I lose another 1/3 of my rights. Okay. So now I'm down to 33,000. And the last third usually lasts longer. It usually lasts, 6 to 12 months. Okay. So what this does is create urgency. And getting back to the idea of investor inertia, this is the catalyst that one catalyst of several that we provide, where the investors are like, okay, this is great. I love your project. Well, okay. The best way to show it is to make an investment. And if you don't make an investment, then you start to lose your rights. Okay, so it's a win-win for both sides. The investors can trade their rights to other investors if they decide, well, I'm not going to invest, but I'll give one of the other investors my rights. We are tokenizing these rights. They will be transferable on the blockchain. They're not currently. That's not a big deal, but it does make it easier to trade them and to provide for liquidity. They can even obtain value. If the project really started to take off, then those rights have its own value. So I wouldn't get too worried about that, but it's part of the reason we are integrating the blockchain into our voting process. Now, let's say you don't win the contest and you don't rank in the top 3. Let's say 5 investors rank you in their top 5 instead of 10 investors. So maybe you rank number 15. That's perfectly okay. And again, different projects appeal to different investors. So it's not really a reflection of the quality of the project in most cases. It's just the appeal of the project to the larger group of investors. So what happens then is that at the end of the contest, we come back to the startup and we say, okay, you rank number 15. That's great. You have 5 investors that really like your project. Would you like to make them an offer to come in as a syndicate and to fund your project on a syndicate basis? So those 5 investors, and again, the startup can say yes or no or whatever they want to do. They can set a new set of terms. So they might say, okay, look, instead of raising $1 million, we'll raise $500,000, and we'll still ask each investor for $100,000. And sorry for using dollars instead of euros, it's just what comes to mind. We then go back to the investors and we say, okay, you like this project, you ranked it in your top 5. The project is interested in getting some immediate funding. They will make this offer to you as a syndicate. Each of you can invest 100,000. You have to complete that in 2 weeks, or at least make a commitment in 2 weeks. And this will give the company initial funding, half what they were looking for, but that's enough for them to get their project started and move forward. You may then also offer rights into the next round of funding, which is great. The investors are going to love that. They may want to negotiate it. You can offer them a board seat if that's appropriate. So at that point, it's a negotiation, and they may come back and say, look, we want a lower valuation, or we want to be able to put in more than $500,000. It's an organic, fluid negotiation between you and this pool of investors. That's basically the mechanism of how we create catalyst and urgency and remove inertia. There is one other aspect to it, which I think is very unique. We're told it's very unique. And that is, we create in most contests a parallel community, which are industry insiders, not investors, but industry insiders. In the case of law tech, what we might have are, say, anywhere from 50 to 100 lawyers, judges, bloggers, people in the law tech industry that also will rank your project. So what we're doing in the big picture is we're creating a ranking system. That's kind of, this whole thing's geared towards initially creating a ranking system that makes it easier for you to access capital. So there are 2 metrics you get when you participate in our project. You get a fundability consensus, which is the voting points of the investors. And that reflects the economics of your project. So things like your traction, your team legacy, your runway, your potential for an exit, your cash flows, if you have any, your potential to generate cash, all the things that investors look at. That's a fundability ranking. And again, it reflects the collective wisdom of a group of sophisticated investors. So even if those investors aren't the ones that invest in your project, you can take that ranking and you can go to other investors and say, look, I rank number 5, or I rank number 8, or I rank number 3. We don't publish the rankings below the top 3. So, if you rank number 50, that's perfectly okay. You don't have to tell anybody you ranked 50. What it will do is give you really great feedback as to, how could you move from 50 to number 3? And that in and of itself is very valuable, we think. Then on the other side, on the industry insiders, they render what we call a product to market fit ranking or consensus. So again, what that is reflecting is what actual insiders in the market that might buy your product, buy your solution, recommend it to other people, use it in some capacity, how they view it. So it's very product oriented. That's really great feedback too. And it gives you an opening into the market. You'll form really great relationships with those folks that, can live on long past the contest. But I think maybe most importantly from a funding standpoint is those 2 consensus rankings are very synergistic. If I'm an investor and I want to invest in this project, but I don't know this space, I don't know law tech, or I don't know this aspect of law tech, then my choice is, I really have 3 choices. If I'm really excited about the team and the project, I can hire a consultant. I can pay them probably $50,000, do a market analysis, try to figure out, does the product gonna get acceptance in the marketplace? In which case, I'm probably not gonna do that for a small amount of money if I'm investing a few $100K. My other alternative is to basically walk away. And that's usually what happens. That's why a lot of deals don't get done. The investors might be really excited, but the amount of diligence they would have to do and the learning curve they would have to go through is too steep to make it worthwhile to deploy a small amount of capital. So we provide a third option, which is a consensus from the industry itself. If the industry is excited about your product, that's half the battle in getting investors to come in. I don't know many investors, even if they don't, if they don't understand or don't like the project or don't like the founders, if the industry is saying, this is the greatest thing we've seen, we'd buy it tomorrow, when's it going to be out? Those investors will likely come and invest in the project. It's just that simple. So your proof of concept, your traction, all these things that right now startups have to go through and try to prove and try to defend, get boiled down to a simple consensus ranking from industry experts that know the industry, that would be possibly in buyers. So that's basically what we do. That's the process. It's novel. I don't know of anybody else doing this exactly like it. We started this before COVID, and now there's quite a few more traditional accelerators and incubators that are moving towards a model, an online model certainly. But I think we're the only ones doing this. If more people do it, that's great, because we think it's a better way to accelerate funding. It's more democratic. I guess the last thing I'll mention is going back to being a greedy investment banker and seeing an opportunity in this to actually do something really significant. Our target market is not only VCs, but family offices. And the reason that's so interesting for us is that, particularly for law tech, because law tech, there aren't that many VCs dedicated to law tech. I know of exactly 2 that have proprietary funds just for law tech. So in order to get law tech projects funded, we believe a diversified community of investors is really important. Your project might appeal to someone who's interested in, Germany or France only. They might appeal to someone who's, really understands natural language applications in law. Might appeal to people that just have a social interest in, access to justice. So you really have to take a shotgun approach and to have a diversified community if you want to get a law tech project funded. So the other aspect to it is the venture capital universe has about $4 trillion of investable capital. And, again, an awful lot of it's in Silicon Valley. A lot of it goes into late stage, investing in Airbnb 2 months before they go public, so you can double your money. So it's interesting, but it's still very selective, and it's hard to get into that money. The family office universe, which and if you're familiar with the term, but family offices are basically wealthy families or congregations of several families that pool their money and have some degree of professional management managing that money. That universe has $40 trillion of investable capital. It's 10 times the size of the venture capital market. It's, arguably the largest pool of investable capital on earth, in modern history. And that universe very much wants to get into venture investing. But they have several problems. They're fragmented. They have a lot of trouble connecting with startup founders at an early enough stage to be able to get some rights or to get a relationship. So they tend to either come in really late, or they go in through as limited partners in venture capital funds, which isn't much fun, or they go in too early. And they go in kind of blind because they meet somebody at a club or wherever, their banker, traditional banker calls them up and says, here's this interesting deal. And, maybe they take a shot on it, but they don't really have the access to the diligence. Even if it's $1 billion family, they can't compete on being able to access deal flow, do due diligence, form relationships, nurture the relationship in the same way that your traditional venture communities can. Even in Silicon Valley, it's the top 5% of venture capitalists that get all the great deal flow. Everybody else pretty much gets table scraps. In a bull market like we've been in, they can survive. Once the market gets a little less optimistic, then a lot of those VCs will basically be out of business. So again, we see this as a really interesting opportunity to position 47 pitches to be a bridge between the family office market. Mostly, we do have traditional VCs and they love what we're doing. And this expanding, geographically expanding ecosystem of startups that, are all over the world. And the nucleus and catalyst for it is just a simple pitch contest. So that brings everybody together in a competitive environment. And it, again, compresses the relationship building period. And, with the hopes of creating funding on better terms, faster, and not only just funding, but mentorship. So once you get funding on our platform, you maintain these relationships through our platform in a very structured and coherent way that hopefully opens doors for your project, gets you introductions to strategic people, provide future funding. So it's an entirely different process than typically what's happening now. So here's a question from Luigi. In terms of when it starts, it's very organic, which is also kind of a different situation. So you can apply to phase 1 right now. Again, it takes about 5 minutes if you have a video. If you don't have a video, you can film a video on your smartphone. You can post that video on 47 pitches, and you've started. Then it's a community decision to invite you into phase 2. We're thinking our phase 2 will probably happen in the next 45 days to maybe 60 days. So far we don't have the 50 startups that our investors are really excited about yet. So we're really interested in getting more. Again, we think we'll have that fairly quickly. And then the first contest will happen, then we'll do another contest probably in about 6 months. So this will be a revolving thing, but it's organic in that the investors tell us when they're ready to start by inviting the first 50 projects that they're excited about into that contest. So I hope that answered your question. That's about it. I mean, that's a lot to digest, I know. I guess the other thing is people ask us why we're called 47 pitches. And basically, it gets back to, again, the process. The average startup in America connects with 50 investors. It takes 6 to 12 months to do that. Then they pitch to 47 of those. I don't know what happens to the other 3. These are Y Combinator numbers, but presumably the other 3 drop out or never give you a chance to pitch. And that's what it takes to get funding if you're going to get funding. On average, a startup will spend about $100,000 getting to the point where they can get funding. Probably a little less now since it's more Zoom friendly. Used to be you had to travel around and actually meet these people. But it's an expensive, time-consuming, process at a time when what you really should be doing is building your business rather than talking to, people like me and venture capitalists. So that's it. If anybody's got questions, we're happy to answer them.
Yeah, Mark, that was an exciting walkthrough, even more than just a product or platform presentation. It was like a mentoring session. I had a feeling that people, yeah, if you're not familiar with the funding process, and I guess a lot of those who listen today and then will listen later on YouTube, they are not so much familiar with the process, and I got very deep and interesting insights. You probably never get if you don't talk to people like you. You have been in the industry for a couple of years, so that's already a very valuable lesson. Well, I don't see any questions so far. Oh, there is one from Dennis. Look
Yeah, I
at
see
it.
something coming in on the chat.
Yeah. Okay, so you see it. Benefit from some. Oh no,
Ben?
that's to me. That's to me. He's happy that he
Okay, great.
was listening. What I would like to ask is, what's the range of funding your investors are looking, or the range of money they are looking to invest? Is it pre-seed, seed, or later stages? What
Yeah,
do
no,
you?
thanks for asking that, because that's actually again a fundamental part of our sort of ethic. In the old days, you used to be able to walk up and down Sand Hill Road in Silicon Valley, Palo Alto, which is, you know, right basically adjacent to Stanford University. And you could walk in almost any VC you wanted and go up to the counter and receptionist, if they had one, and say, I got a great idea. And one of the partners would come out and spend an hour with you hearing about your idea. And those were the glory days of venture capital. That was when it was really venture capital. Now the door's probably locked. It's, you know, they're going to look at you, and if you get anybody to talk to you, they're going to say, well, submit a slide deck. And, you know, then if you read their website, somewhere in the website, it'll say, you know, in all these years, we've never funded a company that sent us a slide deck. And that's a reality. Very few deals get funded that way. So there are still some VCs that do it that way, though, surprisingly enough. And those VCs tend to be the top VCs. And when I mean, I'm not sure you can walk in, but you can connect with some VCs, and they're very open. And the first questions they ask you are not, you know, what stage are you? What space are you? How many exits have your founders had? That's what gets asked today. Again, in the old days, it was, do you have a cool idea? Let's talk about it. And that's why companies like, you know, Intel and, you know, Baidu and all these early stage companies, Hotmail, you know, that's why they got funded, because they found a VC that was interested in the idea and didn't care about how to categorize it. The reason you have these categories too is mainly that there's so many VCs now that, and most of them, to be frank, are mediocre. And some of them are going to be on our network, so I don't want to offend any of those, but they're not the creative type of investors that we like. For them to raise their pools from their limited partners, many of which are pension funds, they have to come up with categories. So they back test and they say, okay, look, for the last 10 years, if we'd only invested in, you know, stage, you know, Series B, startups with the SaaS business model that, you know, had 3 founders that each had 2 exits, then we would make tons of money. So that's what we're going to do. And you, Mr. Pension or Mrs. Pension Fund, you can invest in us because we have a proven model, because this is based on the reality of what's happened in the last 10 years. So that's why they're so rigid. So what we're trying to do, and I don't know how successful we'll be, but what we're trying to do is go back to the days where it's all about ideas, whether it's a concept stage, implementation stage, Series A stage. So we have projects from all different stages. We take a theme. So most of our contests revolve around a theme. So again, law tech is a theme we all understand here. We want a lot of diversity, both in the investor base, and we want a lot of diversity in the startup base. Because as Devin said, we want this to be fun. We want it to be educational. A lot of the investors that will participate will come in thinking, well, I'm probably not going to invest in any of these, but I'm interested in the law tech space. I want to at least know what's going on. So I want to see all kinds of different disruptive ideas from different places. So I'm not going to limit myself to, you know, Series A, whatever. typically what you're going to find, and this is another sort of difference with American investors, and we're about 50-50, but American investors want to overfund your business. European investors tend to want to underfund your business. And so if you're talking to American investors and you say, well, I better be conservative and tell them I can, I can develop, I can get to the moon for $300,000 because I'm really frugal and I really know how to do this stuff and I'm going to work 12 hours a day. That's a big turnoff to those investors. They want you to come in and say, well, look, this is such a great project. I need $10 million. And then let them come back and tell you, well, that's a little heavy for right now. How about 3? The sweet spot's probably going to be around $1.5 million to $5 million. It's hard to get an American investor to invest much less, on a proportionate basis, even on a gross basis. A lot of them don't want to make an investment less than $500,000 to $1 million themselves. With the syndicate process, we can get investors to invest smaller amounts because they're kind of buying a call option. They're saying, okay, look, I'll put in 50K or 100K, be part of the syndicate because I think it's a cool project. It's not going to change my portfolio returns, even if it, goes to $1 billion, because it's just not enough money. But, I'll get a foot in the door. I don't mind maintaining this tiny position because I have a right. I'm going to have opportunities to invest more. So there's really no minimums. There's really no maximums. That's kind of what we're going to be looking at on a syndicate basis. Again, some investors that will participate normally won't write checks less than 3 million, but given our process and given the feedback we're getting from those investors, they can play around and have fun, and they might put their own money in. I mean, that frequently happens. They'll say, well, look, I can't commit my fund to this, but I'll put in $500,000 and my own personal money, and if it works, then the fund can come in later. That's a typical template in with American VCs.
Okay, great. And there's one question from Dennis. Are you working mostly with US investors? How interested are they to invest in Europe based ventures?
Yeah. Well, again, if they're talking to us, then they know that what our value add to if they're in Silicon Valley, they're getting plenty of deal flow. So another aspect of the psychology of venture capitalists, and someday, Devin and I will write a book about, the psychology and pathology of the venture capital mind. But what American investors, at any rate, do not mind having a project fail. It's part of the business. And that's why venture capital is so difficult. And that's, again, why family offices, have trouble getting into venture capital, because they kind of make 1 or 2 investments. Those investments fail and they're like, oh, I'm never going to do that again. That was terrible. I had to go tell my family that, I just lost, $3 million of their money. But that's how venture capital works. It's an odd investment that you're going to invest in 25 deals a year. 15 of them are going to go to zero. Another 5 are going to double or triple over a period of 5 years. And for those numbers to work out, you also have to be in a couple of ones that go up 100 or 1,000 fold. That's the economics of venture capital. And so what we bring to the table for the investors is the other part of the equation, why they don't mind projects failing, they hate projects that succeed that they turn down. I met with the guy who started, there's a platform called 500 Startups, and the original founder, who was a strange guy, he was honest though. He told me he had 4 chances to invest in Uber, and the first was at like a $5 million valuation. And he, his thoughts were, why would anybody use their car to drive other people? That's something a little kid would think of in 3rd grade, it's just crazy talk. So he didn't invest in the first time. And then the second time, they were actually starting to prove the model. And I think it was like a $7 or $8 million valuation. And he looked at it and he said, well, this might be an interesting little niche somewhere. But, I really don't like the founder. He's kind of a playboy and, a little wild, and I don't know, I'm going to pass. So then the next time he had a chance, I don't remember what his excuse was the third time. And then the fourth time it was a $25 million valuation. And, who in their right mind would invest at a $25 million valuation in a ride sharing application? That just made no sense. I mean, they might get public at 30 million, who knows? So, that's what these investors hate. They hate what could have happened. So to answer your question, where we provide value is for investors that don't want to miss what's happening in Europe and the rest of the world now, because that's where the ecosystem, it's not moving from Silicon Valley, but it's expanding beyond it. One of our investor relationships, was a fairly famous guy. They invested in Baidu and Skype, both of which were, obviously non-US companies. And the guy's a long-term friend of mine. And I remember him calling me saying that, he'd raised $600 million to create his fund, invested the entire fund, mostly in his deal was that he could invest in non-US businesses. And that was like, it's like 6 weeks before the tech bubble burst back in whatever it was, 2000. And he told me, I hadn't talked to him in ages, and he called me up and he said, that's just the worst feeling in the world. Everything blew up. And he says, I have these two companies that might save me. One's called Baidu and one's called Skype. And, I told him at the time, I said, well, I know a little bit about those. And yeah, you got a good chance. Every other company's portfolio, he had one other winner, I can't remember what it was, went to zero. So so to answer your question, about 50% of our investor base will be American. It currently is American. The balance is non-American. So it's very diversified. And again, what we're positioning ourselves to be is this bridge where there's no boundaries. A great idea in Berlin, and there's a lot of great ideas coming out of Berlin now, is no different than a great idea coming out of Palo Alto or coming out of Singapore or wherever. And the investors in Silicon Valley like what we're doing because we give them reach. The investors everywhere else, the family office investors like what we're doing because we give them, the community aspect to be able to more safely and more intelligently invest, all over the world. So, and right now we have about 80 investors. Our goal is to bring that up to 1,000. So I want to be very upfront with everybody that we're pretty new. These are our first 4 contests. We're feeling our way along too. We're getting a great response. We don't charge anybody to participate on the platform at this point. We will never charge the startups. So, I think we're offering a very low risk, high value proposition, but no guarantees.
Okay. And one of the issues I see, because I'm now in Germany, but I usually operate out of Moscow in Russia. And one of the conditions is for Eastern European startups to get funding, guys, you have to move to the US, or at least you have to move to, I don't know, Berlin, Paris or so. Would that be something a startup would have to consider?
Well, that's going to be up to whichever investors are interested. It's getting less and less. I mean, when I funded my first law tech project, which is a platform called People Claim, I had a pitch with a Silicon Valley venture capitalist, Tim Draper. It's quite a famous guy, and he was really interested in our project and found us, and we did a Skype call. He was the partner of my friend who funded Skype, so it was interesting because his Skype handle is Tim at Skype. I guess when you fund them, you get your choice. And we were headquartered in Iowa, which is in sort of the center of the U.S. And he asked yes, well, how much money do you want? And we said, well, 5 million is a good number. And he said, 5 million in Iowa? He said, well, first he said Idaho. He you know, people that live in Silicon Valley, that's their own world. So, you know, I said, no, it's Iowa. And he kept coming back to Idaho. He says, well, can't you buy the whole state for $5 million? So that was the mentality that, and Tim's a great guy, by the way, but we're still doing stuff with him. But that was the mentality at that time. It's changing. And again, the fact that they went into Skype and Baidu at a time when VCs were just not funding anybody, practically any business outside of Palo Alto, you know, and those were big successes. So that's all changing. So I would say typically no. Some investors might want you to have an incorporation in the US to give them protection. Others are more adventurous. I mean, we're going to be doing an Africa pitch contest. That was the other one I was trying to remember. You know, most of the investors know nothing about the legal system in Africa. That's part of where the community comes in to help, the insider community. So again, I can't give you a firm answer one way or the other, but it's not like a requirement. Say, I think Y Combinator requires an American, you know, incorporation. We don't. The investors might. They might get excited. If they get really excited, they might. You know, it's up to them, and it's up to you to negotiate with them.
Okay, great. Yeah, Africa is blowing up now. It's amazing what they are doing.
Yeah.
Okay, I frankly I could listen for another hour or 5 hours, but you probably have money to make in order to invest. Are there any more questions from the audience? Nope.
I'm going to go ahead and type our URL, which I think you've got, and I'm also going to add my WhatsApp.
Yes, please. If people want to reach out before they sign up, maybe there are some questions left and they are just not comfortable to ask. To maybe there are some competitors in the audience and they don't want to ask it. Okay, thank you so much, Mark. It was very interesting. Devin as well for your participation, and we hope we can talk to you again. I already have some interesting ideas, and maybe you can also at a later point talk about your startup. You mentioned shortly, but that might be we talked a little bit before the webinar that you have a startup in the access to justice space, and that's also a very interesting topic. So again, thank you very much for the time. Thank you, audience, for signing in, and have a nice day. Have a nice evening for the European community, and have a nice day for you both in the US.
Thanks.
Thank you so much.
Thanks very much. It was really it was